All right. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, warm welcome to you, Charlie. It's been an honor to have you here, in Chennai, virtually in Chennai. And we've been looking forward to actually. Last year, I tried to contact you, but I don't know if I couldn't reach you out. Then you were busy with the survey, and it's an honor to be really an honor to have you here. And I don't think you need any introduction here because pretty much they all know you. You know what your kind of work you do, and because I've been sharing your work for some time with them. And if just briefly, he spent as a long time with BBC, 10 years, I guess, doing the flagship programs of BBC before he got into teaching. Correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie. Then LSE, this experiment, and I've been following his experiment for a long time since he started in a police experiment and AI in journalism. So I'm also personally very passionate about AI in journalism, and I don't personally see this as a threat. I don't know what Charlie, and after reading his report, I'm more excited now after the survey, after seeing his survey. 70 countries took part in the survey, and how AI is going to enhance journalism. So over to you, Charlie. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Devin. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you all, partly because obviously you're in a different place, a very, very exciting place to be, where obviously there are all sorts of problems for journalism in India, some of them very familiar to people around the world. But it's also a very exciting space in India. I've been a couple of times, but I do not claim to be an expert. Obviously, you're all journalists or want to be journalists, so please use the chat to ask questions or make comments. I'm going to be a bit boring because I'm going to go to a slideshow for about 20 minutes where I'm going to try and explain a little bit about the work that we've done at LSE looking at journalism and AI, but also thinking a little bit about what it means and I think why it matters. As Dev says, I think I share his basic positive approach to the technology, but there are all sorts of challenges. So what I'm going to do now is do that thing where I try and share my screen and take you through it. I don't know how many of you are Spider-Man fans of the movie, but the report that we published last year was called New Powers and New Responsibilities, because I think, like most technology, brings with it capabilities, things that it allows us to do that we couldn't do before, but it also brings problems. And in that sense, there's a responsibility when we use these technologies to think about, the downsides, the negatives, and the way that it might change things. The first thing about AI is to say that it's already out there. Anybody out there uses TikTok, a popular social platform at the moment? Well, if you're using TikTok, well, that is very much driven by algorithms. And it's a machine that learns. It adjusts to what you watch on TikTok, and it gives you a completely personalized feed. And as we know, this is it's like a sort of drug. The TikTok algorithm. It's absolutely brilliant at making you addicted to the content. You go on there for 2 minutes, and before you know it, half an hour has gone by. Other people are using it, and this is the Washington Post. So I don't know if you follow them on TikTok, but they do an absolutely fabulous, interesting job using that medium, where the Washington Post, obviously a very, very serious news organization, but they use TikTok as a way of attracting new demographics. So they're already diving into that pool of AI. And it's important to remember that AI isn't just one technology, it's a whole raft of different uses. Here's one, if I can click on this. This is from a newspaper in Stuttgart, and they've done something quite simple in a way. They've taken the data of police reporting crimes and they've turned it into this map where you can, over time, you can see where incidents happened. Some lovely adverts coming up for me. And you can click on the individual ones and work out exactly within a street where it is. So that is a great example of automated journalism. It's a software program that operates largely without human interference. And it provides a very, very good service. It's a way of reporting crime in a very localized way that's terribly useful and terribly easy to understand, and make it very relevant to where people live. So again, AI very much part of the fabric of journalism already. The big sort of headlines, and we've done research at the LSE. I've just marked a dissertation by one of my students who looked at how mainstream media and the tech press reports on AI. And the word that keeps coming up, of course, is robots. The robots are coming. They're going to be taking our jobs. Perhaps like in the movies, some of them are going to go a bit crazy and start killing people. And we're right to be a bit worried about new technology. I don't know if you picked up on this story in the UK a few weeks ago. Because of COVID, people weren't able to take exams in person. School students couldn't take exams in person, so they had to have their final grades assessed. And this was done by an algorithm. And the algorithm was programmed partly by the politicians to avoid grade inflation. It took what the teachers predicted, but then made an allowance for the fact that teachers tend to overestimate. And it turned into an absolute disaster. The algorithm was quite crude, and there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of really good students getting seriously bad marks and not getting into the universities they wanted. So there was a lot of hatred about the algorithm. But of course, the algorithm had been programmed by people, and the terms of that programming had been set by politicians. So in this case, the poor little algorithm wasn't really to blame. It was the people who had designed it. But that's a classic example of the sort of good, bad, binary attitude that we often have to technology in general, and particularly to these AI technologies, because we can't see them. They're in a black box. We don't understand them. They're quite complicated and hidden away. Here's another interesting example of reporting. This was in The Guardian. I don't know if people saw this a couple of weeks ago, where The Guardian had got the text generation tool from OpenAI. OpenAI is the so-called independent, not-for-profit research body funded by people like Elon Musk of Tesla fame. And they created GPT-3, which is this language generator, and The Guardian used it. They programmed the robot to write an article explaining what a robot was. And the headline, as you can see, was a robot wrote this entire article. Are you scared yet, human? Well, perhaps if you're a journalist, you might be, because you think this thing's going to take your job. But again, the reality of this was, of course, there was no robot. There was some software. And that software had been programmed by somebody, I think actually in Silicon Valley. And the software program had actually created a series of different articles, and a human editor at The Guardian then edited them together into this article, which if you click on it, is a perfectly good article. Not particularly exciting, but not a bad effort, to be honest. So for me, this was a really good example of what I think is the reality of AI in journalism, which is the software can do all sorts of clever things, but it's designed by humans and will be edited by humans. So in that sense, it's another tool. And like any tool, it's how you use it and how you design it that matters. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, which of course is now history. But in that there was this computer HAL that was a super intelligent being, and it ended up telling the astronaut that it was in control. It wasn't going to do what it was told to do. That idea of singularity, that idea of a machine or software that can think for itself, doesn't exist, I'm afraid. We keep using this phrase AI, but AI, in terms of pure artificial intelligence that can think for itself, does not exist. The tech analyst Benedict Evans said that instead we should think of these technologies more like lots and lots of washing machines. They're like lots and lots of machines that can do things. They can do specific functions, most of them about prediction. You give it some data, you give it some information, and then it learns, and that's the clever bit of it. That's why it's a bit cleverer than a washing machine. It learns to predict patterns in that data according to the terms you set. And it can do that incredibly quickly, and it can do it at vast scale. And that's what makes this technology supercharged, and why it is an advance. And when you put lots of washing machines together, or you create clever washing machines, you can do a lot of laundry, or in journalistic terms, you can process a lot of information and data. So what we did for this journalism AI project that I've been working on for a couple of years, and I should mention at this point that it is funded by our friends at Google, that they fund the research through their Google News initiative. And what we did before COVID struck, we actually met people physically in these workshops around the world. And of course, we did a big survey of 70+ newsrooms. And we then went on to create, and I'll talk about it in a moment, we created a network of more than 1,300 people with training programs and an innovation program, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you've got the link to the report, so you can see what journalists themselves were telling us that they were doing with AI and what they hope to do with AI in the future. And the big story was not that they were motivated by trying to replace jobs. Most of the people said they were adopting AI because they wanted to make journalists' work more efficient. They wanted to make them faster. They wanted to give them more sources. They wanted to personalize their work and so on. The second big reason was, and this is so important for journalism right now, is to deliver more relevant content to users. There's no point us creating great content if nobody reads it. One of the biggest problems people say about journalism is there's too much of it. Where do I find the stuff that's relevant to me? Where do I find stuff that's local to me, perhaps, or stuff that I'm interested in? And so delivering the right content to the right people at the right time in the right format, AI can help with that. And then finally, this other reason was to improve business efficiency, and that's in all kinds of ways. It's perhaps to save costs, but it's also to do things like processing subscriptions, for example, or membership, or comments, or moderation. So that idea that AI can make your work more efficient. And what's interesting about AI, or that set of technologies, I think it's like a kind of third wave. The first wave, which I remember, like when I was back at the BBC in 1997, the BBC went online. Everyone thought it was crazy. They thought, why is the BBC, this wonderful broadcaster, doing this wacky digital online internet thingy? It will never last, they said. But that was the first big move. The newspapers went online, the broadcasters went online. And then the second wave, of course, was social media. In the last 15 years, with the rise of platforms like Facebook and Twitter, etc. And of course, WhatsApp, very popular in India. And this is a kind of third wave. And what's interesting about this third wave is that it impacts on all aspects of news, the news production process, the news flow. So it impacts, as we've seen, on news gathering. That German automated map was gathering news. It was gathering the data. and it was also part of news production. It created something. It created an article, a map that people use. And in a way, you could argue it's part of news distribution. It's a way of getting readers to be interactive and engaged. They click on that map, and that means that they're using your product. And so we can see that AI impacts on all these three areas of journalism. And that means that it has a systematic significance. It's not just an additional bolt-on tool, it's part of the news process. And because it's systemic, you have to think about it like that. It's not just that you think about one tool, you have to think about how it's going to change the way that your whole news organization is going to work. And this rather boring slide, if you click through, it's from our website, and it shows hundreds and hundreds of use cases. There's loads of it. It's a really great resource for you if you want to see what people are doing. And the point I'd make with this slide, if you look at it, just from the headings on the sections, look how many different aspects there are to these technologies and their relationship to the journalism. Everything from, ethics and diversity, through obviously to news gathering and content creation, fact checking, really, really important. So strategy is also very important. Now, you as an individual journalist might think, what do I need to know about strategy? Well, you do need to know because you are going to be part of that strategy. And certainly your editors and managers need to think about it. Now, obviously, it can create lots of new tools or new ways of doing things. And one of the things we did with our journalism AI project was to create this Collab Challenges. The idea of, and these are about 40 plus journalists from around the world, all from different news organizations, often with different kind of roles within those newsrooms. And we put them together, and they're doing 5, they chose them, they designed what they were going to do. They'd chosen 5 challenges that they think that AI can help them address in their work. And so they're only halfway through. They're going to be reporting in December. They've been working on it since May, June. And they're trying to come up with prototypes, ideas. And I'm just going to take you through some notes about what they've been doing in the different teams. And it's just to give you a flavor, if you like, it's sort of a quick glimpse into the future of what is possible, or what they think is possible in the near future to do with these technologies. These notes are a little bit out of date. They're just working notes, but it gives you a sense of what they're thinking. So team 1 were really interested in problems around diversity, problems around ethnic diversity, gender diversity. And they were looking not so much at the makeup of a newsroom, the people in it. We do know that our newsrooms are not diverse enough, but at the content. So they were looking at how could you use machine learning tools to, for example, map your newsroom biases. So for example, there's a very clever bot that's been designed which crawls across your website front page looking at the images, and it will tell you if you've got, if you haven't got enough images of women, and that's quite a good indication that you're not paying attention to women in news. So they were looking at how could you counter those biases in a helpful, positive way that would improve the diversity of the journalism. Team 2, they were interested in automated related content. Now, related content, you're probably familiar when you click on an article, often it says at the bottom, it will say related articles. But the idea of this team was actually to do that for the journalist. When your editor says, go and do a story about COVID in London, well, where do you start? The idea was that you could design machine learning driven tools that would suggest sources to you, would tell you about previous articles that have been written about this, so that, if you like, there was a kind of research job done for you already. When I was a journalist, in the last century, if I wanted to go and search for previous films that we'd made for a news program, I would have to go down to the cellar and look at the vault and go through various videotapes to find out what we'd done. But the idea of this is that you can do that automatically, and you can immediately see there, can't you, how that's going to supercharge your journalism and give you a head start as you're working. Team 3, they were doing something similar, but they were thinking more about the audience. So every news organization is kind of focused on breaking news and what's happening right now, but there's a huge appetite from people out there for context. Tell me more about this story that's happening. Tell me, where did this story come from? Wasn't there something similar a year ago? Where did this story start 5 years ago, perhaps? And the idea is to use evergreen content. Now, evergreen content might be something like an explainer of what are the symptoms of COVID. You don't have to keep writing that story. It may need updating, but the basic, science is there. So why not use the evergreen content from the past to update you? So this was a way of trying. This is actually it sounds easy, but in practice it's very difficult, because you have to tag the content so that you can search for it. And ideally, you'd like to do this automatically. So when somebody clicks on your story, it comes up with background articles, explainers, and other related articles for you as a reader. So that was another really good idea, which, again, this is so important for journalism at the moment, for news organizations. Journalism can't afford to keep rewriting stuff. It can't afford to write great stuff and then throw it away. You have to get the best value out of everything that you produce. So that was a really interesting idea. Team 4, theirs was more complicated. This was the idea of how do you reduce, let's see this one. Yeah, how do you increase people's attention by recommending or personalizing stories for you? Now, this happens already. For example, when you sign up for a news app, it's possible that it asks you, what are you interested in? And you probably say something like international politics or serious science research. And of course, you end up just clicking on sports stuff and celebrity news, don't you? But this is this idea of trying to come up with a way of personalizing news and recommending news to you that takes your data and your behavior, but also tries to make it more interesting than that. And I think the particular idea they were going to look at was a personalized newsletter. Newsletters are becoming really an important way to get to readers, and that was their main idea. And again, the AI could help make this automatic, because of the amount of effort. You can't have a journalist creating an individual newsletter for each reader. You want that to happen automatically if possible. The last idea was, again, really super important. We all know that money makes the world go round, and that journalism desperately needs money at the moment. And one of the successful business models has been subscription or membership. People sign up, they pay, they join. But the trouble is that a lot of people either become passive subscribers, they don't seem to engage much, or they give up. They don't like it, or perhaps even they just find it too much, too overwhelming, and they give up. So how can you encourage people to get the content they like, to stay engaged, and also then to stay subscribed? So they were looking at all sorts of ways that you could use a combination of the audience data and machine learning to identify how people are behaving, and then give them things they like. And one of my favorite ideas was this idea that you'd do gamification of loyalty. So I don't know what you guys think about this idea, but the idea would be that every time you read a story to the end, for example, you might get a gold star, or more interesting ways to allow you to share that story. And you increase your social credibility by sharing stories and other people reading them. So trying to make it more fun, more interesting, and more engaging, and to build that kind of relationship with the audience. And again, this is something that would be impossible to do through human manual effort. You want to make it as friction-free and as automated as possible, and also as responsive as possible to the individual reader. I mean, you all know how annoying adverts can be when you go online. They relentlessly pursue you because you once looked at getting some golf clubs, and you get relentless golf club adverts. It's a very sort of subtle, sophisticated process. So that gives you a flavor of what these people are trying to do or are thinking of doing, and we'll be publishing the results in December. I doubt that any of them are going to near to creating an actual tool, but they're coming up with super ideas. They're thinking hard about how they solve problems, and all the time they're focused on making the journalism work better. And to do all that, you do, as I said, need to have a strategy. And one of the problems in the news media is, at the moment, from our report anyway, only a third of news organizations have any kind of AI strategy. And as one of the respondents said to me, he said, it's not surprising we don't have an AI strategy. We don't really have a strategy for anything. And this is a big problem in the news industry, that we've only recently become more professional, more like other industries in thinking about issues like the adoption of technology. Obviously, there are lots of challenges. If you read the report, I don't want to suggest for 1 second that this technology is easy. There are huge problems in terms of knowledge about these technologies, that we don't have the people, the data scientists. If you're a data scientist, in Chennai or somewhere, and you know how to program all this stuff, who do you want to go and work for? Do you want to go and work for the Times of India, or do you want to go and work for some sexy digital retail startup, or best of all, Google or Facebook or something, because they will pay a lot more? So journalism has to compete to get those skillful people. It also has to spread the knowledge more widely. There's no point in creating these tools unless the journalists understand how they work and how they can edit them, for example. So I won't go into the detail of these approaches, but if you're interested in this as a more strategic issue, then obviously you have to think through a strategic approach to the adoption of AI. And because we're very nice people on the journalism project, we actually created a training course for people. It's a free training course where people can start at least to think about what it means to adopt these technologies in your news organization. I don't know if any of you guys are thinking of doing startups or joining news organizations, but that might be useful to you. But what will definitely be useful to you is this. And I really do think that all of you should go and look at this. We've had more than, I think, 35,000 downloads of this already. It only takes an hour. And this doesn't matter if you've got no tech knowledge. You need to have a bit of an understanding. And this takes you through, in pretty simple terms, the kind of issues that I've been talking about in this lecture. Gives you an introduction from a journalist point of view. This was a course that was designed with journalists, for journalists to think about machine learning in particular. Just to sort of wrap up, thinking about the future, and obviously you are all the future of journalism, we hope. I think it's important to realize that, just as I said with the move online, just as I said with social media, these technologies will change the way that journalism is created. things like job titles. They're going to be new job titles. And there will be some people who won't be doing certain things. There are certain journalism tasks that are done by humans at the moment that won't be done in the future. Generally speaking, that's a very good thing. There are lots of boring, repetitive, easy tasks that at the moment we're wasting human effort on when we can get machines to do them. But it's also going to change the culture of journalism. It's going to become more in production, is going to become more interested in technology, but it's also going to make us think more about what we can do. You know, for example, investigative journalism, we had a big global investigation last week looking at banking that was done collaboratively. And I think critical to this is going to be education and training. So obviously at places like you are doing, which is fantastic, that you are looking at this, that you are ahead of so many journalists who are working journalists who have not looked at this. So I think that's absolutely critical, both before you become a journalist, but obviously when you are one as well. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the one thing that emerged from both the survey and the work we've done since then is there is this appetite for collaboration. Now, you know, in my experience as a journalist, we did not collaborate. News media is intensely competitive and takes pride in its independence. People don't like to work with other people outside of their newsroom. Well, that's changing. So we're seeing that within news organizations, the marketing teams, the tech teams, the editorial teams, they are all now talking to each other. Between news organizations, we're seeing collaboration. And we're also seeing collaboration externally. I mean, I work at the LSE, I am collaborating with news organizations, but also with startups and of course with the tech companies as well. And I think that's really interesting that the structure of the industry itself is changing. So our project is going to plow on. We're hoping to do it again next year. We've got those training courses. We've got another one coming out in the autumn. We're going to be publishing the results of our collaborative experiment. And you're all welcome to sign up to our network. If you go to the Journalism AI website, you can sign up for our newsletter, which will give you regular updates on what we're doing, and we'll give you information about Journalism AI around the world. I just wanted to end, though, thinking about you people at sort of early career stage, perhaps, thinking about what it's going to mean to you personally, if you like. This is me, you won't believe. Yes, I'm still alive. But this is me from too many years ago, 30 years ago, when I started as a journalist in South London. I was a reporter on a local paper. And back then, this was what my newsroom looked like. You know, I had a manual typewriter. You could actually smoke at your desk. And the black object on the bottom right is a telephone. And there's a wire that connects it to the wall. And that's how you communicated with people. There was no Google search. There was no email. And indeed, when I went out of that office, which I spent most of my time doing, being out of the office, if I wanted, for example, to ring, to send in a story, I would have to find a phone box, put some coins in it, and file my copy over a phone. Now, the point of this is that bringing it up to date, I think many of the values I had as a journalist still apply. Technology is not everything. Journalism is still carries out the basic functions and I think needs the basic aptitude. So if you don't mind me being a little bit sort of, what's the word, preachy about it, these are what I think the 6 C's that you need to be a successful journalist. And it's not all about tech, although I think all of this, when you're using that tech, all of this should come into play. You know, you fundamentally, I think you have got to be curious. You've got to be a curious person. You've got to be fascinated by the world, because if it doesn't interest you, then it won't interest the audience. And by that, I mean, I did a lot of stories about things that I thought were boring. You know, I'd be given a story in the morning by the editor and I think, oh my God, how dull. But I had to be curious about it. I had to find something interesting in it, Otherwise, it wouldn't interest the audience. And if you don't interest the audience, then go and find another career. Commitment, I think, is really, really important. You know it's a tough job. Journalism involves hard work, bad pay, and everybody hates you. You've got to work hard, you've got to keep going, you've got to believe in what you do, and you've got to have a kind of, when I say a moral commitment, you can choose your own morals. One of them you do need is to try and tell the truth. I don't care what your politics are, but you have to have a commitment to the mission of journalism, if you like, even if that mission for you is just to make money. That's fine. Creativity is really important, and this is where I think the tech starts to come in. You have to use all the possible ways to tell a story. Not every time, you might just use one way, but you are blessed as a generation because you have more ways of telling stories than ever before. And don't let anybody tell you that you can't use a particular way of telling a story. If it works, if it gets the interest of the audience, then that's great. And the technology is there to serve your creativity. Your creativity is not there to serve the technology. Content is really important. And by that, I mean the new content, the added value. Don't just duplicate. There's so much duplication. If you Google a news story, you will see 50 news stories that are all very, very similar. How can you add value? Perhaps you can report something new. Perhaps you can give somebody a voice who didn't have a voice before. Perhaps you know something that other people don't know. All those are really, really important, much more important than how beautiful you look or how sexy your headline is. Critical, I think, is really important. And that can mean people being critical of you. One of the best things that can happen to you as a journalist is to be edited. Now, it could be by a human being. It might also be by an algorithm that suggests things, corrects things, that helps you. And, you know, edit yourself it's really important. That's how your journalism gets better. And then reflect on how you do what you do and think about why you do it in a certain way or why you've chosen a particular topic, and always ask yourself why anybody should care about that. And then obviously learn from mistakes. Journalism is a human craft. It's not a science. It's the first draft of history. It's not the finished article. So you will make mistakes every day. If you don't make mistakes, then you're not trying. And finally, this is going back to the technology. Understand the information systems because you're going to be working within them. Try and use all the tools possible, even if it's just once. You know, I've made a habit of always trying to try everything out once, even if I never use it again, just so you partly so you don't miss out, but partly so you just understand what academics call the affordances of technology. What could they do? What might they do better? And then finally, just be aware of the trends. Things like AI, it's interesting. It may not be relevant to you today or tomorrow, but it might be in a year's time. And it's always better to be prepared. So that's it from me. I'm very happy to take questions, comments, or anything else.
Yeah, before you start shooting, just confine yourself to one question. Please don't make sweeping statements, please.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead, please. Who wants to go first? Yeah, I'll read out you can put in the chat. Okay, Abhirami, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Good morning, sir. I have a very ridiculous doubt. Sir, is it possible that with the help of artificial intelligence, will we ever be able to feel everything which is going on in the journalism world just through touch with no medium being used in it?
Oh, what do you mean by touch? Do you mean sort of like a chip planted in your brain?
Without any medium, sir. Like, that's what I'm saying.
No. All a medium is medium just means pathway. Media is a pathway. And there's always going to be something that connects you to the world, even if it's a microchip in your brain. Now, obviously, there's lots of ways that that mediation has become much more intimate and much more immediate. So when I was a journalist, if you wanted to see my work, you had to go to a newsagent and pick up a newspaper, or you had to sit down on your sofa and turn on the television. You had to do it at a certain time. You had to do it at 7 o'clock. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see my journalism. Now, of course, you know, with our mobile phones, we can, you know, look at, we don't even choose. We get a stream of news coming into our private space, the same space where you get updates from your friends, where you look at food recipes, where you see pictures of dogs and cats and so on. Suddenly there'll be news, either because somebody's shared it with you or because you subscribe to some kind of news service. So that's much more immediate. And I've written about how that makes news, I think, much more emotional and personal. But sure, yeah, there's going to be, AI is going to accelerate that immediacy. It's going to suggest things much more quickly and more in a more personalized way. And then there's these possibilities of things like AR and VR, which again are going to give a more immersive sense. And of course, those will all be driven very much by AI. One great example is voice activated. You know, when you talk to Alexa and ask Alexa the news, that's an algorithm, of course, that's using machine learning to offer you that content. So there'll always be a medium, thank God. Otherwise, the Media and Communications Department would be redundant. Next question.
Yeah, Niladri.
Yeah.
Yes,
The
sir.
last question. So do you think that medium can be God?
But I think the media can be God. That's a cracker. No, there is, the only God is Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, Niladri, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Good morning, sir. I had a small question about blockchain and decentralized servers in journalism. So where does the future of cryptocurrencies or decentralized servers fall in journalism? And does the role of journalists be subject to developers, AI developers or ML programmers when it comes to journalism?
Yes, two questions there. The first one on blockchain. I looked at blockchain a couple of years ago. I had a fascinating trip to Silicon Valley and spent time with some interesting people. And at the time I thought, I can see no reason to use it. I couldn't see any problem that it solved. You know, if you can find one, tell me, but I couldn't see a single problem that blockchain could solve better than anything else. So I thought it was a complete and utter waste of time back then. And I still do. I think it's almost entirely irrelevant to journalism. And I think and journalism in the broadest sense, I don't just mean news organizations, I think it's a complete waste of time. And the one organization, I can't remember what they're called now, but it was an American organization, very good people, tried to come up with ways of doing it. They wanted to do it. They were blockchain and they failed. They stopped because it was a waste of time. The second one, do I think the developers will kind of, you know, boss the editorial? No. And I'll give you a good reason why. If you can create a news service that's purely automated, that's fine, but that's all you're doing. And if you can create that software, then everyone can do that, and it immediately becomes of little value. You can do it for some. So Bloomberg, for example, have highly automated share reporting and company reports because it's very simple, very easy. They still need to monitor it. It can still screw up sometimes, but that works. But that is just a simple service. The whole organization has to then do the other things I talked about, which is adding value. And that is about judgment, creativity, human relationships, all those aspects. So it's a fascinating, I speak to data scientists all the time. I spoke to a bunch yesterday. It's a fascinating interface. The data scientists need to become more journalistic. The journalists need to understand the data science much better.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sai Venkatesh, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Hello. So I just had a doubt wherein when you were speaking about creativity, curiosity, and the other stuff that we need to have as a journalist. So with the advancement of AI, don't you think the other way around might happen? Like we might lose our curiosity, we might lose our creativity, and like we'll be more focused on giving input to the AI rather than focusing on journalism. Because even Stephen Hawking believes that the more we advance into AI, it could be hazardous. Like so what's your take on this? How can one be convinced? How can me as a journalist be convinced that the
Yeah,
other way might not happen?
no, you're really right. It's a choice. It's a choice. In the same way that every day a journalist has a choice to, for example, you can write a very simple sensationalist story, perhaps one that's not really very factual, but you know it's going to get lots of clicks. So you have a choice. You can do bad journalism or you can do good journalism. I disagree. The evidence I've seen, both from the theorists of AI, but also the practitioners, the people putting into practice, is just do not worry about the singularity. If you look at the DeepMind researchers at Google, if you look at the OpenAI researchers, they think that they are probably decades away, even with quantum computing, from any kind of pure AI. And indeed, there is a perfectly respectable argument that says it cannot exist. Now, I don't want to disagree with Stephen Hawking, of course, but I think that that it's a sort of, there are plenty of things to worry about with this technology. There's algorithmic bias, and I do think you're right that there's always a danger with these technologies. I remember, with social media, when a new platform comes along like Snapchat, and everyone thinks, gosh, we've got to be on that, we've got to pile into this, we've got to use this lovely shiny new thing, it's amazing. And then after a few months, no one's reading your journalism, and you think, why did we do that? So you've always got to think, what problem does this solve, or what does this enable us to do better? Now, in the end, journalism is about adding value. It's about human to human communication. It's one human being, a journalist, interpreting the world, reporting the world, trying to make you interested in the world, to another human being. Now, machines can do a lot of that. If you think about it, we get in a car, we drive the car to meet with other human beings, but the car doesn't decide where we go.
Khadija.
Hello, sir. So my question is related to the legal bit a little bit. So,
Right.
yes, sir. So a large part of the lawyer's work is to do relevant research. However, today we have AI like Contact Express, Neota Logic, which have been taking over functions like drafting and case assessment research. So does this mean that, there is a strong possibility of there being an army of like robo lawyers who take over the legal profession tomorrow?
That's really interesting. Are you studying law?
So I've just completed it. 5
Yeah. So you're worried. Yeah. Yeah, my son has just started at the bottom of the law ladder. Law is a really interesting example. As I understand it, the answer to your question is partly yes, because as you will discover, I don't know what you call it in India, but in the UK, I think it's called doing your articles. It's called literally your articles when you start as a solicitor or a junior lawyer. And for a few years, it's the most boring. It's like a bad version of secretarial work. You are the person who has to draw up the standard contract. You're the person who has to do all this incredibly dull stuff. But you need a lawyer to do it because it's the law, But most of it absolutely can be done by machines, or at least done by the machine, and then a human needs to check it. So law is actually a really interesting profession. It's, in many ways, it's more vulnerable, if you want to use that word, to this than journalism. Because law has got so many, by its very nature, the law is the law. It's a set of rules and regulations. It's almost like a program, a software program. So it's very easy, or sorry, lawyers will disagree with me, but at the lower level where people start their careers, it's very easy to automate that process. So yeah, but again, you hope, just as with journalism, you hope that means that they will get those people to do more interesting things, you know, that you won't have to waste your time being cheap labor for some lawyer for 5 years before you're allowed to practice, you know. So I think it's a really great example, thank you, because it's great. The career structure is going to change. And as I say, I hope hugely talented law graduates don't waste the best years of their life doing house conveyancing and stuff like that.
Yeah, Munif.
Hello. I'm going to date back to a video of yours I saw close to a year ago where you mentioned that fake news is good in a sense because now that you know that there's a problem. I'm sorry, there's a disruption in the line.
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat that because
there's a disruption in the line.
Yeah. Sounds like you're frying eggs. Whoa.
No, it's not my line. Okay, I'll just repeat my question.
That
So
you're clear now.
I was actually watching a video of yours, and I came across this point where you mentioned that fake news is good in a sense because now at least you know there's a problem out there. So how much does AI weigh into this? Now, how much of a solution can AI provide with respect to battling fake news? Because we have this garbage, this information garbage influx out there. So do you think it can either go both ways? It's a double-edged sword, or do you think it can actually swing by in the right way?
Yeah, there's a great article I can't remember where it was. There's a great article yesterday about this. I think it's a double-edged sword that, you know, we see with things like deep fakes and so on. I mean, the whole problem of the reason we're aware of fake news is because in 2016, a bunch of people realized that you could spread stuff very quickly online. Now, some of the people doing that were people like The Guardian, the Mail Online, journalists who realized that if you had clever headlines, nice pictures, things would go more likely to go viral. But obviously, bad people realize this as well. And certainly, absolutely, machine learning is a godsend to those people. It's a fact. It's a bit like airline travel was a godsend to drug dealers. Technology can always have good and bad effects. I think we're definitely seeing huge problems, not so much with journalism. With journalism, the fact checking is great because you've got a very limited amount of content that you can set the machines to work on. You know, you can, there are really good ways of fact checking bits of content, and also ways that you can make your content more credible to the machine. So the platforms and the news organizations are working on ways of embedding codes, having widgets that identify more credible information. But we can see that the big networks like Facebook and YouTube have an enormous problem, and it's because they're not spending enough money on it. They are not, and they've discovered, I think it was YouTube just recently switched away a bit from AI moderation of content back to humans, because the AI just wasn't catching enough of it. But I think there's a fundamental problem here, which is, they operate at such enormous scale. There's two problems. One is that they operate at enormous scale and speed. And secondly, it's the opposite, that you've got a situation like WhatsApp in India where it's closed, and the misinformation, even if you've got the tools, the machine learning tools, they can't always get into those closed spaces to identify it. So the depressing news, I suppose, is, it's an ongoing battle. And I was the director of something called the LSE Truth, Trust and Technology Commission, which, if you're interested, go and have a look at that online. We discuss this and possible ways of addressing it. But obviously, I'm very conscious that India is not alone in this, but there's a serious problem, and the problem in the end is about the public and about the people doing it. The often political people who are doing it for motives, and you can't stop them without stopping political speech. And at that point, we're into a whole kind of ethical dilemma. But I think it's an enormous issue where AI can both help and hinder.
Varsha, you're up next.
Hello, sir. So I was just wondering about if AI sort of brings in this entire issue of bias, because whatever said and done, even though it's a system, like you said, it is by a human designer. So there is a chance that their conscious or unconscious judgment might come into this. So is this even an issue to consider, or and a challenge to the future?
Definitely. You're going to need people to edit the algorithms, and you don't just edit them after they've started working, although that's necessary. What are the results you get? But you're going to need them to edit them before they even start. If you like, it's the equivalent to when I was an editor in TV News, and I would go into the edit suite and look at what they were putting together, and I would say, no, that's wrong, that's right, that's biased in that way, and I want it to be biased in a different way, and then it would go out. That's what's going to happen with these algorithms. As I mentioned, I think it's important to see that there are also human biases. I don't know how much you've studied the idea of framing and of news agendas. We're already very conscious that, and it's a particular problem in the UK, where journalism has in some ways become more homogenous. It's become more basically people who went to Oxford and Cambridge and did PPE. And so there's a very narrow range of, you could say, ideology or life experience. And that means those people are biased in a different way. Now, I've got no problem with bias, as long as you're aware of it and as long as you're transparent about it. We are all biased. We all have life experiences and views. But as you say, with an algorithm, that's different because it's hidden and you don't know why it's doing something. So again, like any other tool that you use, you need to be aware of that. And I think it's a fascinating area. I also should say that there's this is a role for journalists to know about AI so that they can look at the potential bias of algorithms elsewhere. You know, we need much better reporting on how these things work. We probably need less reporting about how robots are going to kill us all or take all our jobs, and more reporting on what difference does it make? You know, what's the, and also being more self-critical about blaming the machines. So we say, oh my God, Donald Trump, you may think he's a disaster. He was created by fake news. No, he wasn't. A lot of people voted for Donald Trump for lots of good reasons. You know, the economy, his views on immigration, or whatever. Blaming fake news for Donald Trump or blaming Twitter for Donald Trump is, in itself, it's a bias. It's a sort of media centricism that ignores the real world.
Shruti, you can go ahead now.
Yeah, hi sir. So I wanted to ask, AI also has a limitation in understanding of empathy, right? Which is very essential in newsrooms and in reporting stories. So how do we go back and place that empathy that is out of equation there?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. If you have a look at my blog, I've written about the idea of emotion as an organizing principle for journalism. And the paradox of it is that emotion has partly become more important in news media because of the machines. The machines are very good at knowing what you like, because you literally press the like button on Facebook and that sends a signal about your emotional response to something. And that then drives the way that content is consumed and shared and so on. So in that sense, the machines are definitely, they don't have emotions, of course, but they are driving emotions in good ways and in bad ways. You can see something like the Black Lives Matter campaign in America. Was an emotional campaign in the sense it was about values and identity, very much about identity, wasn't it? And it was about solidarity and empathy. I think these are all, and anger. It was about anger. Anger can be a good thing. If you're angry about racism, I think that's a noble feeling to have. So not all emotions are bad. Emotions can be good, and they're a vital part of journalism as a human-to-human relationship and experience. It's how we experience the world. We don't just experience the world as data or facts. And I don't think that the AI can replicate that. It can certainly measure it to an extent. And I was looking at, indeed, this morning, I was looking at some new software around trying to measure sentiment, which is a sort of holy grail, mainly for advertisers. They want to know how you feel, because then you're more likely to buy something. But it's very difficult to do that. If you're just going by text, or even if you're going by facial expressions and so on, it's very difficult to measure sentiment, and very difficult to program responses to it. You know, you may show that you're really happy about something terrible happening to somebody else. That's a really strange emotion. How do you quantify that? How do you respond to that? How do you operationalize that? It's very, very difficult. So I think, again, sorry to be boring, but it's a kind of hybrid answer, which is the algorithms can help a lot in understanding how emotions work, perhaps in media, but they're not very good at identifying them or doing something with them. And in that sense, it goes back to my more optimistic scenario around AI, which is, well, surely that's the opportunity for the journalist, that they can be more emotional. Now, obviously, that raises all sorts of issues. How subjective do you want your journalist to be? To be honest, I get a bit bored of journalists being, you know, wildly excited about everything, or super outraged about everything, or constantly referring to themselves. You know, I quite like a bit of objective journalism sometimes, that's quite cool and rational. But that's an emotion too, you know, to want dispassionate, factually orientated journalism. Well, that's a value judgment on my part. So that's my answer. Not a clear one, but I think it's an opportunity.
Charlie, how long do we have? Can we take another 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
So we take two more questions, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anushka.
Hello, sir. So my question is, are personalized news feeds, which are created by AI, I mean, on various platforms, drawing people into bubbles of information? I mean, which also shields them away from like other views or like challenging views for that matter.
Yeah, you've hit one of my favorite subjects. I'm so glad you asked this question. Here's my thesis. I think filter bubbles are a really good thing. And I don't think that media particularly creates them. And I think we've always had them. So and I'll explain what I mean by that. I think you're quite right that we should be worried if personalization, for example, and personalization happens automatically with algorithms, but it also happens mainly by your choices. You choose who to follow on Instagram or Twitter, or you choose which news app you're going to buy. Generally speaking, you know, you have a strong influence on the kind of content that you're going to get. So you have a choice. But yes, we do know that the recommendation algorithms of YouTube, for example, if you click on something, it'll say, do you want some more of this? And there's something a bit stronger that you might want. It learns what interests you. And I think in the past, it was much worse. We had far fewer sources anyway. And people, you know, in the UK, people didn't go around reading 6 newspapers a day. They would read one newspaper. They'd read the Telegraph if they were conservative. They read the Guardian if they were liberal. And to a degree, those newspapers reflected different views, but they were, if you like, a kind of echo chamber. And secondly, the research actually suggests that something different is happening. There may be filter bubbles, and I love filter bubbles. I am a filter bubble. I'm a liberal North Londoner who's journalist. I love Italian food. I support West Ham United. I don't want to hear stories about other football teams. I just want to hear stories about West Ham. I love my bubble. It's me. Okay, so please don't tell me that I have to be somebody else or think completely differently. But I'm also very interested in other people's points of views. I'm interested in being stimulated by new and different things. Journalism has always been about novelty. So what we can see that happens with online is that people who get their news online actually use more sources than somebody sitting at home just watching Fox News, for example. Now, what happens is that they may not like that experience. I think that's the interesting bit, that people who go online are more likely to bump into people they don't like. So it's like going to a dinner party and there's somebody who's been invited to the dinner party who has got completely different political opinions to you. He supports your enemy football team, you know, the worst football team you can imagine. And it spoils your evening because you hear this idiot talking. Or it might be that you have a really fascinating conversation with them and get a fresh perspective on the world. So I think that's where the problem around filter bubbles is. Now, there's a different problem, which is closed groups of people who do not want to, to refer to anything else. That's a different kind of problem. And you see this around, often around sort of extreme political activism, where they deliberately create sealed units. You see this, I mean, I did lots of work on media and terrorism, and that's what the terrorist activists do. They create little closed media bubbles. So that's a different thing. So I'm generally speaking much less worried about filter bubbles than other people are. People who worry about filter bubbles usually mean my filter bubble is beautiful, your filter bubble is terrible.
Thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah. The last question, Radhika, you can go ahead.
My question would also be along the lines of bias and news authentication by AI. So news organizations are held accountable for every piece of information they put out there. So when we are integrating AI into a newsroom, how do we hold it accountable?
That's a really good question. And it is, you're right, it's a bit similar to the previous one about AI bias, but it's a really good framing of the question, you know, this idea of accountability. And you make a really, really good point, which is, technically at least, news organizations are supposed to be accountable, and they are accountable in an informal way, in the sense that you can see what they publish and you can say it was good or it was bad, and you can then, I don't know, tweet about how rubbish it was or how brilliant it was. And there are also forms of accountability in terms of money. You know, if you do terrible things, perhaps people won't buy your product. And of course, law and regulation, to a degree, you can be held accountable to that. So any sensible news organization that starts to use these technologies, machine learning, etc., should be thinking about that. They should be thinking, what if this goes wrong? What if this is inaccurate? And my experience of it so far has been that the news organizations, if anything, the problem is the other way. They over worry about it, that they are far more worried about the inaccuracy of the robot, if you like, than they are of their own journalists. You know, I think generally speaking, news organizations would do well to be more self-critical about their own product, but that should definitely include thinking about how do you check the accuracy of the algorithms and what they produce, and how do you hold it accountable? You know, if your reader or your user, whatever, wants to complain or has a problem, have they got a way of doing that? So I think that's one of the ways that I talked about how jobs are going to change and the structure is going to change. As I said, you're going to need an algorithm accountability editor, as well as all the other editors that we use.
Yeah, Charlie, there are a lot of questions in the chat box, you know, so I don't think you'll have time for that. Can I take one more, please? Can you take one more? Hello.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead. One more.
Yeah, Jyoti, you can go ahead. Yeah. The last question, that's it.
Okay, sir. So my question builds upon the thing that you just answered about accountability. So my question is not really about whether I can see AI as something positive or negative, but in the context of having very little editorial diversity in Indian newsrooms, because of the demographic composition of it, a lot of castes and genders are not represented. Another, because of the politics playing its hand, like politics and businessmen who have certain vested interests investing in certain organizations and not in others. In that context, like the lack of editorial diversity will filter into, like in terms of biases, it will filter into the AI as well, right? Even with the very important function of maintaining transparency, that lack of editorial diversity will impact that function of AI as well, right?
Yes, definitely. I mean, definitely. I don't think it's particularly. I mean, all the things you mentioned are real, and they're all important, and we all need to do much more about it. And I, of course, as I said before, you can use this technology to create clickbait, to pump out misinformation, to go viral, just to make money. You know, we have that choice with all technologies. You know, you can use AI to build weapons of mass destruction if you want, or you can use it to try and counter pandemics, for example. So, you know, technology doesn't have a moral, doesn't have a sense of morality. It's always imposed. So you're absolutely right. You know, the context, who has the power in a news organization or anywhere else, will determine how you use that technology. But where, I mean, as I mentioned in the Collab example that I gave during the talk, journalists are struggling to even kind of know what the problem is. When you think about diversity, for example, how diverse is your audience? What you know, what do they want? How diverse should our content be? Is there any point us having a Tamil language channel for our service? No, because we don't have any Tamils in our area, perhaps. You know, so in that sense, data plus machine learning can at least give you a better sense of who your audience is and what your content is as well. It's very interesting. A friend of mine did an experiment at the BBC, BBC World Service, and he did a survey of newsrooms asking them what kind of news they produced. And I'll try and keep this simple, but basically he had 6 different types of news, which he'd done a survey of the audience, and the audience had said they wanted these 6 types of news. When he asked the journalists what they're actually producing, they were only producing about 10% of what the audience said they were interested in, which is incredibly shocking. So 90% of their time, you could argue, was in a sense not being wasted, but it was not delivering the value to the audience. So that's that's what I mean by diversity. It's that journalism should try at least to reflect to some degree in its makeup and its content and its audiences, should try and reflect the diversity of the people who are using that journalism.
Thank you so much, sir. It's wonderful having you here, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. It's been an honor, and it's been very integrated. Thank you so much.
The questions have been absolutely fantastic. So really good luck. Please keep in touch.
Sure.
Sign up for that newsletter. And, let me know how you get on.
I just shared in the group. Yeah, I shared it in the group.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Yes, sir.
Go on.
Thank you, sir.